Jollians, Knickers in a knot. BLOB and the PDO. It's not science fiction, and I am quite sure that you will find tonight's conversation interesting, informative, and, if I may boldly suggest, entertaining. I want to thank all of our panelists who have so kindly agreed to participate and share their memories, expertise, and stories. And it is my pleasure to introduce and to offer a special word of gratitude to this evening's moderator, organizer of this event, architect and member of the Historical Society Board of Directors, Jim Alcorn.
Thank you, Heath. Are these on?
You know, probably not.
Well, that's all right.
That helps.
Jim, have you been in a fight?
Yes. There's actually no truth to the rumor that Barbara has taken me on. No, it's a dermatological experiment, I think. Anyway, thank you for being here tonight. It doesn't take very much for La Jolla's folks to get their knickers in a knot, as you know. There was the children's pool rope, of course, and 3 stories versus 2 stories in the residential zones, parking in the core, and back in the early 80s, it was large office buildings. The tailored zoning regulations that we enjoy in our center of town were adopted in late 1984. And it's one of the many planned districts within the city of San Diego. There are several. So how and why has the PDO come about? And this is what we will discuss tonight, the causes, the history. Proposition D came in 1972, about 12 years earlier, which set a height limit of 30 feet. The responses, the results, and so now 25 years on, are we better off than we were before? Should we use it as gospel, or is it really a good guide and should be a little bit more flexible than we have been interpreting it? So on the panel with me, I have selected and coerced various folks who have had some, indeed, involvement in this. Angela Sliera is a former city staff member and PDO ordinance author. And Bob Collins, who's been a PDO advisory committee member for as long as I can remember. And I think we both started together just after the PDO was put together, and I was on that group for a long time. Ione Stigler, who is presently the chairperson and is an architect of the La Jolla PDO Advisory Committee. And then there's Mark Feldman, who's a sculptor as well as an architect, well known in the architectural community. And he was chairman of a citizens advisory group that was reviewing the various drafts as Angelus worked with it, and I think he was involved with the La Jolla Town Council in that regard.
And the review of projects, too.
And the review of the projects. And I'm an architect and the moderator here, and former member of the La Jolla PDO and an active member and of the Community Review Associate, and since 1984. And not my nemesis and good friend Orrin Gotch, who's been an advisory committee member from the very outset. And of course, every time I would bring a project before the committee, I would always begin my presentation by saying, well, I think I brought a project that even Orrin Gotch can vote for this time. So with that, I would like to ask Angelus if she'd give us a little bit of history of the beginnings and why the PDO came in and what did BLOB have to do with the rest of the excitement that seemed to be involved, and I think Ellen Browning Scripps was even a member of BLOB in its beginning.
Well, in spirit, probably. Thank you. Are we better off? Well, we must be, because if we weren't, this place will be jammed with people. As you will see, can everybody hear me? Yeah. As you will see from the presentation, I decided to give a little background and set the stage, because as far as I can see, I see.
Could you please use the microphone for some of that?
Pardon me?
Could you please use the microphone?
Oh,
Thank you.
there. It's nicely, there. It's nicely stuck. So, but anyway, let me know if it's too close, if it's too far, whatever. I usually don't like to use the microphone. So anyway, I thought I would set the stage and give some background from the technocrats' perspective and from the very beginning. So there are three topics I want to talk about to set the stage. One of them was how it came about. The other was how it evolved. And lastly, seeking the solution. So how it came about. There were some interesting urban development conditions in the 1980s. The first one was that economic pressures made La Jolla a prestige address for office buildings. So everybody wanted to build, that was anybody in town, wanted to build an office building in La Jolla. The second one, we had out-of-date zoning. The original 1934 zoning ordinances that were adopted by a backwater community, which was San Diego, were in place, and they just could not handle the development pressures. And the third one was that the Coastal Commission was in action, and one of the obsessions that they had was the insistence on parking. They increased the parking ratios, and they require those parking ratios on anybody stepping on their door. And what happened is those parking ratios had a ball effect, that it made people have to demolish existing buildings, build buildings to the maximum, so that they could pay for the parking that they had to provide. So what were the impacts on La Jolla? Dramatic changes in scale and character. Eventually they were called the BLOBs. Lots of community serving uses, they were lost. We used to have a store where they sold wood, and we don't have it anymore, and things like that. And then there was the conversion of the traditional downtown village into a high-end suburban office center. So those were the three dramatic impacts of the community, at least from my perspective. So how did it evolve? The La Jolla Community Planning Group started fighting all of these projects that were coming about. There were appeals all the time to the city council. There were big hearings with the Coastal Commission. It was really hard work for everybody. And something needed to be done, but we couldn't do anything. So one day, and this is perhaps an experience that only I could have, somebody comes to my office at the city. Her name is Sue Oxley. You may have heard the name floating around. A few of you, because most of you are new faces. But she came to the city, and she asked for somebody she could talk to about La Jolla. And so I came out, and she said, I'm really concerned about La Jolla. I'm really concerned about these big buildings that are being built in La Jolla. And I said, well, you should be concerned because we are getting many of them, and it's a problem. It's a real problem with the community. But at this point, city staff cannot do anything. We need to have direction from the city council or from somebody to do something. But there are ways that we could mitigate some of the problems. And she said, well, then how do I do it? And I said, well, the first thing that you need to do is maybe talk to the community, talk to your neighbors, see what ideas you have, and then get together and form a proposal, form some ideas, and talk to your representatives that you vote for every other year. So she said, oh, okay. 6 months later, here she comes with 98,000 plus signatures. And she is coming to the city council requesting something be done. The council chambers are full of people. She comes with a whole entourage of people carrying these boxes of signatures. I mean, those boxes didn't stop coming. There were so many. I never thought 98,000 signatures would take so much room, but they did. Anyway, the council then responded. And the first thing they did is they approved an emergency ordinance reducing the density by half. But the emergency ordinance could only be good for a year. So they directed city staff during that year to come up with a solution. So that's where we ended, seeking the solution. The methodology we used were interactions with the community, continuous ones. We met weekly, and Pat Dolberg and Dick Dolberg know that, and Sam and Bob and Orin and Mark know that, because we met faithfully every week in some bank, different banks, who would offer their rooms to us. And usually we had at least 20 people at the meeting. The community input took place throughout the process. There was lots of time to discuss, there was time to analyze and to seek solutions. And we wanted the real solution. We didn't want any losers around. We wanted to really try to come to a consensus and kind of fix it for everybody. So no one was dismissed. Everybody had a say. We found more things in common than not. And it was interesting because we would start talking and one person would say one thing and another person would say, I don't agree with you. But then they would continue the communication and pretty soon they were in agreement. So the moment they were in agreement, we would write it down. They agree on this. In that manner, listening to all of those conversations, we completed the ordinance and went to adoption at the city council in 9 months. Now, that's a record. And I used to laugh and say, it's just like a baby, It's like it wants to do something like this. And it did become a baby. Actually, it took probably 6 months because the additional 3 months are spent in preparing for hearings and noticing more hearings and stuff like that. There was minimal or no community opposition. As a matter of fact, only one person opposed the ordinance at the council hearing, and we had the chambers filled with people. There was a standing room only in the back. And even that person, whom I won't say who it was, but who's here today, had some concerns, and he raised the issues, and the mayor turned around and asked us to answer them, and we answered them, and then by the time we were finished, this person said, oh, in that case, I agree, I support it. And everybody just sent a roaring applause. So the council approved. It was unanimously adopted by Planning Commission, Council, and eventually the Coastal Commission. The Coastal Commission was a little more difficult to sell because they had this obsession with parking. Anyway, now what I'm going to do is quickly, I'm going to take you through some visuals. There we go. Okay, now it's working. This is what we found. And what we did is we did a dissection of the animal. And one of the interesting things is, see that word, that FAR? FAR means the density of the building. That building you just saw is 2.6 times the size of the lot. Another thing that's interesting is that the parking is underground. So they had to build this huge structure of parking to sustain that building. And the third thing that is important is that it has basically 4 stories of activity. Now we go to the next one, and this one has 2 times, a little more than 2 times, 2.3 times the amount of square footage times the lot. It's office, it has 3 stories. This one is the same. It's a little less. This is only 2 times. It's 3 stories also. It has underground parking. So you can see the tune as it comes up. This is what happens. This is the cumulative impact of having too many of them. And that's what the community was really concerned about. This is what the community liked. And we did a number of photographs, and we said, tell us about these buildings. What do you think? Well, the consensus was 1 and 2 stories were fine. The consensus was that they wanted to keep the village character of the community. They loved our icon, which is La Valencia. And that was interesting because La Valencia has 2.6, 2.7 times the size of the lot. It doesn't look that bulky, does it? It has an average of 4 stories, but it has no parking. So here is one determinant that begins to tell us parking is the real killer. Here are some more views of things the community liked. The average that they liked, that they were comfortable with, was a floor area ratio, density of 1, meaning just as much square footage in your building as you have on the property. And parking was not important. So here is another one, and this one was 1.08. Now that building looked a little more massive, but it really isn't. Also, it has practically no parking. We were concerned about view blockage, so we did something about view blockage, the views to the ocean, the pedestrian areas, and ways to penetrate buildings so that there is more pedestrian activity and more opportunities for retail development. Some of them very historic. And places where people can enjoy themselves, the wonderful climate we have, and where we can have some landscaping instead of this. And this is where we started hitting the public realm. This is what we were getting with the new large buildings. This PDO is the first tailored zone in San Diego that dealt with the public realm, with the sidewalk. These were the sidewalks that the community wanted to preserve.
Yes, me too.
So here goes the regulations. The first thing we did is we identified 4 zones because they have a different character. And we gave them different density. The second thing we did, this is running automatic. The second thing we did is limit office development, by God. The third thing we did is encourage retail. And this is where the bonus idea comes in. You have a base zone, which is the 1.3 and the 1.3 and the 1.0. You have a bonus to a maximum of twice the size of the lot. How do we do the bonus? You provide retail. We had lost Walker Scott. That was our store. So how do we bring it back? Give them a bonus, by God. We wanted mixed use of residential and retail. How do you do it? You give them a bonus. They told us it couldn't be done. Everybody was a naysayer. You want residential? Well, give them a little bonus, maybe not as much. You want office? No bonus. So that's how we structured it. Then on property development regulations, we discourage lot consolidation, so it was better to have a small lot development because that's how they are variables. We also require a setback in the upper floor, and we also require a diagonal setback at the corner here in order to let people kind of congregate. We talked about the 100% corner, for example. View corridors. On Prospect, we wanted to establish some view corridors. So Prospect, that part of the zone has got special regulations to require more setbacks so that people can look into the ocean. Parking regulations, that was the big kicker. Parking ratios, we had to incorporate the Coastal Commission parking ratios because they were the regulators. But we decided to give exemptions to small lots. So you had a small lot, all you needed to do was put some parking along the alley, and that was it. Just one row of parking would do it. Provide design requirements for surface parking lots. This is the first time that the city seriously looked at landscaping on parking lots. Provide exemptions for projects that are rehabilitating their buildings. The Coastal Commission used to also require parking ratios for people who were rehabilitating their property. We said, no, you rehabilitate, no parking requirements. And we also provided off-site parking through joint parking plans and in lieu fees so that everybody didn't have to build a parking structure. Now, that has been a little controversial because some people have counted twice and 3 times the same parking spaces. But on the other side, let me tell you that when we did the ordinance, to today, there are 2,000 unused parking spaces in the blocks, in the big buildings. They are not used whatsoever. And our criteria has always been, even when we were doing the PDO, use those parking spaces, find some way to use them, and don't load up the community with any more of that underground parking because it's a killer. So that's what we did. This part was very hard to get by the Coastal Commission, and I'll have to grant it to my staff, Greg Conner, who was like a little Doberman, just grab onto a piece of meat and wouldn't let it go, that he fought it out with the Coastal Commission and prevailed. And he was very good at the staff level dealing with that. So we also dealt with surface materials, building materials and colors, and the emphasis was natural materials, stucco, concrete, and bricks, and also the surface colors, the building colors. And we concluded that the buildings the community liked were either white, natural brick, earth tones, light ones, and pastel colors. So that's what we put in the ordinance. And finally, we looked at the streetscape development encroachment permits, and we put some requirements for the kind of trees that we would envision there, etc. And as I said, that was the first time that was done in the city because the engineers had the total exclusivity over the design of the sidewalks. And we said, no, the sidewalks are for people, they relate to the buildings, the building owners are improving the sidewalks anyway, so we want them to improve them right. So that's what we did. And we prevailed. We had basically 3 types of permits. The ministerial permits, it was a tailored zone, you did the standards, you went home, except that there would be a review by the community to make sure that you lived up to the spirit of the ordinance. without dealing so much with the standards, but dealing more with the character of the building. That's where the board comes in. We also had discretionary permits. Any changes from the standards would be a variance, and that's more difficult to obtain. And then other types of permits that the city at the time reviewed, which were discretionary, we would also review them as discretionary permits. And finally, the streetscape encroachment permits. And finally, the special use permits were applicable to hotel, motel development, which has limits, above ground parking structures, which we put some development standards on, first time in the city that was done, and heritage structure preservation, which were supposed to be historic sites and buildings that are potentially contributing to a historic district. That's why we didn't call them historic sites, we call them heritage structures. Anyway, that gives you a little longer outline than I wanted of what the PDO was about. And with this, I turn it over to the next person. I'm sorry if I took too long.
Oh, I don't think you did. I think that was it was very good to recall all of those things that we all went through together. Bob, you've been on the Citizens Advisory Board since you were on and off, I think, since the very outset, as I was, for a number of years, and I don't think you are on presently, but tell us what your thoughts were on those things.
Well, I'll just say a couple of words about how the PDOs worked out. Angela's told you very well about how it came to be, how it was built up. It was a very thoughtful document. It initially came in a book about this size. And I sat on the Planned District Ordinance Committee for, I don't know, 20-some years. And it was interesting to work with it, but in doing so, we found that there were a few refinements that were needed. And so a few years ago, Warren and I and Jim and others got together with all the planning groups in La Jolla and put together, I think it was 24 changes that we felt needed to be incorporated in the PDO. Refinements, maybe is a better word. And so we wrote those up in a number of issues and got those supported and approved by all the planning groups in La Jolla. Everybody approved it. Went down to the city, and the city was supposed to act on it, but it died. And the city has never pushed it through, even though the entire community, without exception, supports the 24 refinements, which are not major changes, but they're necessary, we found, in working with the ordinance to be more accurate as to what the PDO required. So we're still waiting. We're hoping that maybe with Sherry Leitner down there, that Sherry can push that through for us one of these days. But a lot of good, hard spade work was done by every organization in La Jolla to modify the PDO with those refinements. So with that, I'll stop.
Is that city council action?
The city council did not act on it.
And is it okay to jump in?
Yes, go right ahead, please.
When was this? A few years ago?
Oh, it's been about 10
No.
years ago.
That's about when I first started getting involved with stuff. I've heard about it.
Yeah, there's some definitions and some things that need to be sorted out that would be helpful. And there are some things that give property owners advantages that they wouldn't have across the street where the PDO doesn't apply. So, from some points of view, from the property owner's point of view, they're just as happy that they don't proceed, so. Warren, what do you think?
Well, I guess first of all, I'd like to give an acknowledgement to my mother-in-law, who was one of the persons who was very, very active in getting the 30-foot height limit in La Jolla. She was one of those that was out collecting a lot of signatures for that, so I'll credit her for that. Jim, you started out early and asked if we're better off, and I certainly would say yes, that we are better off for having had the PDO. Unfortunately, the problem that we've had, in my opinion, with it is a lack of enforcement from the city. And so when you talk about flexibility, the city, particularly Development Services, is providing a great deal of flexibility to this document that wasn't intended to be flexible. We mentioned in Angela's report there about mixed use, and mixed use was originally intended to be retail or restaurant with residential above. That's where you got your bonus, was providing residential. The city now has interpreted mixed use as if it's restaurant and you have a little office, that becomes mixed use. So when you talk about the parking requirements, they have really been diminished in regards to how they're interpreting it, which was wasn't the intent when the ordinance was written. A little bit of history, one of these things, how many remember Sluggos coming into La Jolla? Which is now, I think, Paradise Walk, sort of mid-block in the 7600 of Fay Avenue.
77.
77?
77. And this was a change from retail to a restaurant, and so that was going to require additional parking. So because they didn't want to provide the parking, they put in a valet zone, which they were going to valet the cars from Sluggo's, a hot dog's place, into the B of A garage. Well, the valet zone went up, it never operated. But the point of this was that this is part of the shared use parking agreement that we had. And so I'd hate to tell you how many probably other businesses have used the B of A garage to come up with a shared parking agreement. But once they got it approved, the city never enforced it. So they were reusing these parking spaces continually. So again, it was a case of enforcing it, or having at least some mechanism where we could follow it to make sure that these businesses were indeed, if they weren't using it, for example, if they weren't using it for their guests or their patrons, at least they maybe would be putting their employees into those spaces. And then Bob just alluded to it. I mean, we requested changes to the PDO, and if there was a flaw today, I think, in the PDO, was that there wasn't an easy way to amend it to take care of these issues as they came up, and so that we could have nipped them in the bud, so to speak. So that's all for me.
Yes, Mark, you were there at the beginning.
I was there at the beginning, and I was fairly young in my architectural career. Was very interested in college in community planning and how you create livable environments, not just buildings, but what happens in the sidewalk, what happens in the street, landscape, that sort of thing. And so I actually had a small practice in La Jolla at Cave and Prospect, where the big pink Bob Stern building is. Mm-hmm. And this all started coming up. People were really upset, as was I, upset at the big office buildings that I thought were pretty foreign to the La Jolla environment. And I watched this whole thing going on with Sue, and one day I heard that they were going to have a group who would get together to write this ordinance. So I thought, this is right up my alley. And came down and started participating, and they said, who'd like to lead the meetings? And I raised my hand, no one else did, so they said, okay, you're it. But what I found very interesting was that the committee had Sue Oxley as probably one of the most extreme people, very well intentioned, and we also had a developer. So we had a real spectrum of people, and I felt that I was kind of right in the middle. And really looking at it from an architectural standpoint or a design standpoint, I think I feel the same sort of things that Bob Mosier feels, or any of the other architects, where you're kind of running this game as you design, this game between what you think is right in community design and what the developer wants, right, Jim?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And so I saw this actually as a maybe somewhat subterfuge that you could maybe get some rules written that would be great to use to design by, because I wanted to design in La Jolla. And we felt that La Jolla was a pretty special place, that there was a well-established pedestrian environment here. It all worked pretty well, great historic resources of buildings here, and that really the correct design should be to build off of that and enhance that pedestrian-oriented community. And I always felt that architects needed good tools to work with their clients to do a good design. We also needed rules that were pretty clear, and so one of the things that we decided early when we wrote this was that we wanted to try to build an ordinance where there were very specifics, and it wasn't subjective. There wasn't a design review board that would be very subjective about this. And I don't really quite understand how it all came about so well, but I mean, we had a great staff and a good committee who we had a lot of the same concerns about good design and came up with some great formulas for, I think, trying to keep that pedestrian-oriented environment together. As an architect, I know there's been a lot of discussion about parking, and that's always been the problem, and we learned very early, you know, the old saying, form follows function. Well, we really felt form followed parking. You figure out the parking first, and then you design the building, and it's unfortunate that that's how it became. So we really tried to do some things that would be a little bit more realistic about parking, provide shared parking in a walkable community where let's say you're in your office or your home and you're walking to a restaurant and you go to Ace Hardware down the way, that there really is a shared parking sort of environment here. And we tried to make that happen. Interestingly enough, once it all got done, I started off heading up the review committee and trying to apply these rules to projects that were coming forward. And we really tried as a committee to work with developers early in the process so they wouldn't get so far down the line with what we really felt was a bad design that didn't take advantage of this environment, and push them in the right direction, help them comply without necessarily providing design review to them. And it was a 4 or 5 person committee and worked pretty well in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
So
We also had city staff.
we had city staff, that's right, we had one city staff person there. So I really thought the process was very positive. I thought with the disparate personalities that we had in the group, that we really came together and put together a great ordinance. And I left to go downtown and do the same sort of thing downtown about 5 or 6 years later, and was involved in that, but I always had a great feeling about the work that we did here.
You did. It's great. I own is the chairman of the present Citizens Review Advisory Board, and has taken on this task of trying to make all of this make sense. And it is different now than it used to be. We used to meet every Monday afternoon in my conference room, every Monday, and there were people coming there all the time, and there was always a staff person there, and the city input was terrific. And there were at least three or four people every week, and so there was this great turnover and great disruption in the office. But we felt that it was necessary, and so it's a little more formal now than it was then. I know, but tell us about it.
There's a saying that's attributed, I think, to Harvard University, that they tell new people who are coming in that you're going to be drinking from wells you did not dig. And so sitting here tonight and hearing you guys talk about what you went through, I really want to honor the time and hard work you guys spent going through all this. I didn't realize either that I had so much in common with Mark. I showed up at my first La Jolla PDO meeting as the Bird Rock representative, and they needed a new chair because Joe LaCava was moving on, and nobody raised their hand. Nobody raised their hand, and finally I was like, I'm not going to sit in a room for a half hour with nobody raising their hand to lead the group. And so I said, okay, you guys are going to get the newbie leading you, but you have to be prepared for what might happen with that. And thus I became chair. Luckily I had Orrin on board and a few other long-term members who have been incredible guidance for me. But there have been a lot of changes that have occurred from, I think, what was the ideal that was set up. Some intentional and some unintentional that have occurred. One is they're waiving those really cute little copies with the La Jolla plan on the front. And the PDO that I have is the one that's on the internet that got fairly significantly altered with the zoning code update in 2000 that the entire city went through. And there have been some unintentional consequences caused by that zoning code update. One is the lack of regard for parking for intensification of use. When something goes from small retail to a restaurant, you can imagine there is a much heavier demand on parking, and that's not now acknowledged. The city also instituted what they call process 1, 2, 3, and 4. I'm not sure if there's a 5. If there is, I've never gotten to it. What is a 5? Okay, a level I haven't been at. So, in their estimation, a process 1 is now a development by right, and all you have to do is show that you're meeting the code, and they believe that they can process down at the city all of the permits that meet their interpretation of the PDO without needing to discuss them with us. And we also no longer have a staff member at the meetings, and I don't know how long ago a staff member disappeared. Remember, I'm the newbie at, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 years.
10, 15 years. 10,
15 years.
Ago.
Yeah, so, which almost correlates with the 2000 zoning code update.
Mm-hmm.
I have sometimes felt in the last few years that I have been left holding a hollow shell. and wondering what we can do about it. We recently had Chris Larson, who's a current planning staff member from the city, come and address the group. And I had been rather indignant for the last couple of years that they weren't sending things to us, because my bylaws said quite clearly to me, and this was handed to me as, you know, here's your testament, that the Plan District Ordinance Committee shall review these applications with the following objectives. So in my little mind, I said, okay, I'm supposed to be reviewing everything, and I'm not seeing a 2/3, 3/4 of what's going on. And so I was rather enlightened last month at our meeting when Chris Larson explained that no, they have a development by right and they don't need to come before us. We voiced back to him comments that you were saying, that, and he said to us that our right was that if something did go in wrong, that we could then enforce it. And we said, no, we really don't want to be punitive. We want to be helpful to the business community. And so sort of left, you know, a little bit a rock and a hard place, especially the last 4 years with business being so hard for people. Someone invests in painting their building some nice garish color, you know, because they need to attract the attention of whatever businesses, clients they can, and you quietly have to go up to them and say, no, no, no. Now you have to, you know, we, as a community, we can't enforce this unless we go to someone else, and we really don't want to get you in trouble, but it would be nice, the community would like to see X, Y, and Z. The other issue with painting is that painting doesn't require a permit. So there is no mechanism for someone to be pushed to come before us, even if it wasn't only being heard down at the city, and it was being heard by us. So that's a little bit of a catch-22. Don't let anybody know. I don't want to sound just, these are the problems, these are the problems. We are really, really talking within the committee about how to go about enforcing and how to go about advising. And Chris Larson, the planner, again last month, told me that I must be doing something wrong because somehow prior committee chairs had everyone fooled into thinking that they had to come before us. And I was sort of like, oh, okay, well, and I really did think everyone had to come before us, but I wasn't going around dragging people into the committee. So anyhow, that's where we sit today. What I am encouraged by is that I do know that there is, in the change of leadership down at City Hall, there is definitely a bigger emphasis on communities and what communities want. And I'd like to get the 24 refinements and see where they can go in terms of improving what we're doing. And continue the dialogue with Chris Larson about not wanting to be punitive, but wanting to be advisory. So that's where we're at.
Well, I think we probably have a great resource in the fact that Chris Larson is the planner responsible for this area of the city. And he has been most helpful over the last number of years as he's matured within the department. and before him, Gary Geiler. And Gary used to come to these meetings that we had early on. And so incidentally, if somebody has a question at any point in time, please bring it up. The interesting thing, though, is about the PDO is, and I've been living with it for the last 25 years every day, and the trick is, and the desire is, to get the code to work with you instead of against you. And if you can figure out how to make it work with you, as Mark said, maybe that's what you needed to convince the client that they shouldn't try to get 10 pounds of sugar in a 5-pound bag after all, and that you can point to the scripture and verse and say, here, you're not going to do that. We can't do that. The other thing is that developers and property owners are reluctant sometimes to get involved in the process if they don't have to be involved in the process. And when we have projects that theoretically I look at it and I say, you know, you really don't need a coastal development permit because you meet all the exemptions. And we'll go down and we'll talk to the people at the city and say, here's where we stand. Does this make sense to you? I mean, 4 eyes or 6 eyes looking at a project is better than just 2. And they say, well, yeah, we agree with you, but what does the community think? So we go back and review it with the 2 groups that, the PDO is the first group, then there's the DPR group that has to look at it as far as how does it relate to the community. And if they're in agreement, then that is, we proceed to get a building permit or attempt to get a building permit. But as one example, and here is a project gone awry. We had an approval for 4 townhouses at one point in time in 1995, and facing the ocean. But in the intervening years, and the owner came back 15 years later and said, well, let's go. Let's just build 3. Okay, let's just build 3. But in the meantime, the code has changed, and well, by the way, Mr. Alcorn, now you have 2 front yards instead of a front yard and a rear yard because there's a street on either side. So you need to provide retail on both sides of the property. Retail doesn't make any sense. The community says it doesn't make any sense. But the city says, but that's what the code says. And so after the owner has now, over the last 2.5 years, spent about $250,000 or more keeping going on, and more reports, and it's very discouraging. And you can understand why they try to avoid it at all costs, if it's possible. So there are good things and bad things.
Yeah. Well, you know, in my time, we were doing things much more informally, and I have always done things informally with developers. And I have found that when you do that, and
Yes.
you talk to developers early, it's much easier
Right.
to get things that later you cannot get. Why? Because they haven't invested into a product so heavily, number 1, in money, and number 2, in pride. Pride is a big part of all this. And we were doing it for historic buildings too, and it was working like a charm. And we didn't have to advertise it. Pretty soon, every single person in town that wanted to do something to a historic building was knocking on my door saying, I want to talk to you. I have this idea. We would have this chat, and I would bring in the Historical Resources Board, and we would have an informal chat about that project, those ideas, and made some suggestions, and lo and behold, the next time they came, those suggestions were even improved. So I'm a big believer in that. I think the problem is the city sometimes kind of hamstrings itself. They say, no, we have to have a clear process and we have to, you have to put in your application for a permit, and then we have to review it. And of course, by the time somebody puts in a formal application for a permit, they are already putting out a lot of money because permits are not cheap in this city. So then everything starts going wrong. So I agree with you that now that we seem to have a mayor that cares about community, we really need to work on that piece. We really need to look at those 24 items and maybe some others that need tweaking, and we need to, process the changes. It's not that difficult to process the changes. All it needs to do is go to a council committee, present it, have the cooperation of the city and the decision makers. That's critical. If you don't have their cooperation, forget it. Have their cooperation, and then pretty soon you are working with staff, you are doing the changes, you're going to planning commission, you're going to council, and it's done. Again, I have done ordinances. La Jolla is not the only one. I did Old Town after that, also in a few months. It can be done. But you need to have the cooperation of the people in power. If you don't have it, then you are out of luck. And this is the time to take advantage of it.
Dick?
Yes, with respect to these 24 changes you want to push through there, is Sherry Leitner helpful or not? And if she's not helpful, why isn't she helpful?
Has she been presented?
Warren, I don't remember, I wasn't on the committee at that point in time. Do you remember what how it proceeded?
Sherry was very supportive of all 24 of those items, so she doesn't have any problem with them. I think it's been more of a political thing for her to try to get other councilmen on her side to move it forward. And I don't think she's found that the timing is maybe quite right to do that yet. But we're hopeful that we can get that done. She's willing, I know that. I'd like to just make another comment. Since the PDO went into effect, the land prices in La Jolla have changed materially. Maybe at the time the PDO came into being in 1984, I think, the prices were maybe $200 a square foot. And now the prices on Girard and Prospect and so on are more like $800 or $900 a square foot. And that puts additional pressures on the landowners to want to do something to try to get some return from that value of the land. So those are pressures that are going to become harder and harder to deal with as time goes on.
Well, my question was, when you said you need, until you have the support of the city, that you won't get very far, what does that mean? I mean, is that an office? Is it an organization? Is it?
It's the support of the leaders, the support of the mayor and the city council members.
Okay.
Because really, leadership sets the example. If they set the example that they want to help, then staff pretty much follows. If they don't set the example that they want to help, that they want to do something else, then staff kind of pulls back. So it has to be at the political level, the mayor and the city council, the leaders of the city.
The city planners are responsible for their time to work on the projects that they've been assigned to work on. And so they can't just on their own initiative pick up the 24 issues and run with them. They actually have to have direction from city council through Sherry's office that they have now been assigned the time to deal with this, and that it's now part of their budget for them to work on it.
I think one problem that is playing out nowadays is, some of you may remember some years ago when there was a decision that elections for council would be by district. They wanted the council members to be responsible directly to their district, because very often the council person that was preferred by the district did not make it in the general election. They The primary was done by district, the general election was done citywide. A few of us were torn, I was torn. But there are some good aspects about the citywide. And the good aspects about the citywide is that once they sit on those seats at the city council, the person of Council District 4 is almost as responsible for you as the person from Council District 1. Nowadays, 4 is not responsible for us anymore. So it's not interested, unless between the council members they have something to exchange. So it becomes a barter, and now I can say it because I'm free and I'm retired. Say all these things. But that's the real life.
Dick?
The La Jolla Shores PDO was the first PDO around, and at that time the councilmen were chosen citywide, and that made a big difference because the La Jolla Shores Association got in to see Floyd Morrow, and the guy from the southeast San Diego, I've forgotten his name.
Leon Williams.
All those people loved La Jolla, and it made a big difference when it came time to make the tough decisions.
Yes, and of course, the La Jolla Shores PDO is the loosest PDO in the city, as far as side yards and setbacks and different things, and it's wonderful.
Yeah. You know, I would just want to say something hearkening back to the original ordinance. My feeling as an architect and planner is that many communities fall into the trap of trying to obstruct things, stop things from happening, and don't work as much proactively in the beginning of the game to set the standards for what they'd like to see in a positive manner. And I think what was beautiful about the original ordinance was that there was a big problem with these office buildings. And everybody sat down and really put down in writing what they wanted to see that would make the community better. And I sure would love to see a much more positive effort in the various communities in San Diego to promote good design, to take care of problems. Like, I live in Mission Hills right now and have for quite a while. One of the problems we've got is there's an ordinance that allows SDG&E to put these big transformers out on the sidewalk. And you don't really see them in the original design plans. They show up towards the end of the building process. And it just drives me crazy because something as simple as that really ruins the sidewalk, you know, the pedestrian-oriented environment. And yet most communities work harder, you know, fighting something that's too big than working hard at saying ahead of time, you know, we want these design rules in our community. And maybe La Jolla needs to get back to that. You know, partially it's the new rules, but really reestablish a committee to look at it again. Maybe you will lead it. I don't know. Yeah. But to say, how do we make this a better place?
Right. Well, I think the same thing can be said for backflow preventers and all these other things that creep into the public right-of-way and right on the edge of the property that are right there in the first thing that you see. Yes?
Every time you all have presented a problem, and there have been many problems and frustrations expressed, it always seems that the cause of it is the city of San Diego. And I'm just curious as to how you all feel about the independent La Jolla movement, and whether if it were implemented, would that result in a better control of our environment by us?
I have a funny answer to that, and it's my experience. And I do support independent La Jolla. But my experience is that once upon a time, one of my roles was to review state and federal legislation for the city, and also come up with ideas. I was representing the city council at the city level for improving, you know, ordinances and things. And in this particular case, we were looking at enforcement. And communities wanted to have an active enforcement program that would give tickets to people for doing the wrong thing. And the tickets would escalate, just like the police picking you up, doing something bad when you drive. And we were told right away by the city attorney, cannot do that. So I got on the telephone and I started calling cities all over. And I did find some answers. But the interesting thing is, every time I called a small city, I would say, I have this problem, I'm from the city of San Diego, I'm looking for this kind of a solution and so on, who can help me? And they would say, oh yes, we'll contact you with so and so, and I talked to the person that knew everything about that issue. As I got into bigger cities, I would call and they would say, oh, well, I don't know, and who do you think that would be? And I would say, well, why don't we try the planning department? Oh, okay. So they call the planning department, I get there and I ask the same question and say, oh, geez, I don't know who that would be. Now, what area of planning would that be? And I would say, well, how about this area or that area? Eventually, I would get to somebody, if I was lucky. Most of the time, I didn't. And by the time I got to the poor soul that was at the end of that pipeline, I would just roar laughing because that person didn't know anything. and they did have an ordinance in the books because I saw it in the literature search. So the moral of the story is that big government is not better government, just like big business is not better business. There is a critical mass to a unit that is working. And the smaller units are more efficient. And people there do several tasks at the same time, but they have more control of more things. And it seems to work better now. That's my perspective.
I'd just like to say something. The group that was the advisory group that was put together to draft the PDO was really a very nice cross-section for all of La Jolla. I mean, all interests were really represented, and I think that's what it takes. Whether independent La Jolla, let me just say it, my years here, we can become awfully dysfunctional at times, and I've lived through some of that, and I'd just like to give an acknowledgement to Joe LaCava, who's here this evening, who I think really did one heck of a job in turning around the Community Planning Association. And I mean, he has, since then, that organization has become a whole lot more functional. And so I guess my answer to that is what we really need is just good leadership.
I wanted to make one comment about where we are today. If you looked at Angela's pictures here, you saw older buildings going down Girard, going down Prospect, Fay Avenue, mostly two-story, built in the 30s, 40s, maybe a few in the 50s. But those buildings today are kind of passé. And with the value of the land, there's a lot of pressure on those property owners to do something. And then we get into the various ordinances, like the Plan District Ordinance, and you kind of wonder where this thing should go. In other words, how to deal with that, because the pressures are there, the community is changing, our population is growing, we've got a great impact from the university and its students, the number of restaurants are increasing greatly. Office space is still difficult to rent. Commercial space, pretty good, especially on Prospect. The rents on Prospect are almost double what they are on Girard, for example. When I first came here, we thought Girard was the best commercial street, but that's changed. So we have to be aware of what's happening in the community and what's happening to values, and some of these old buildings are going to will be going, you know, the way of age.
Historic, you mean? Right.
Well, a couple of my things have been said about me. I guess I've got some political capital for words. Because I've been to a number of these things, and I really appreciate. I came here because I didn't know the history. You know, it was kind of before I was born, so it was good for me to hear because I've had a lot of questions over the years. But I think it would be a shame if we didn't reflect a little bit deeper and look a little more internal about where we're at. Having been chair of the PDO committee for about a year and a half, which is about all I could really stand, because I couldn't drive down the streets anymore without seeing violation. You know, it becomes awfully easy because we like to spend our time in other ways to blame someone else, to blame the city, to blame the developer. But having spent the time as all of you have, you know, I think it's a little unfair, and it really stops us from really trying to grab hold of our community again. You know, we talked a lot, a few minutes ago about the 24 changes. No one knows where those 24 changes are. Scott Peters tried twice, Sherry tried once. For a laugh, every time there's a land development code update, I resubmit something. And we need to get serious about recreating that list because no one has it. And it is, as I always said, kind of a staff allocation issue. There's nobody objecting to us pushing those through. We just don't have them in clean enough form that someone can take them and run with them. And I've done this 3 times, so I know that's really the truth. And as Angela said, it's very complex. You have to get the staff to do it, and the planning commission, and the city council, and the coastal commission, and maybe there's an environmental, and that takes resources. So if we're really serious about them, and if they're 12 years old, maybe we don't need them anymore. But if they're really serious, we can get those pushed through. If we come up with this clean set, strike out underline, we can make it happen. The other thing that I'll mention is that I've heard a lot of reference to developers. And I understand why we talk that way. I talk that way. As if there is someone who sneaks into La Jolla and does bad things and then runs away. Most of the stuff that gets done is by La Jollans. The houses are too big, or if there's a use in the village you don't like, chances are it's a La Jollan that's doing that. And so when do we have the conversation of who we are as La Jollans and how we're going to go back to the effort you guys did back in the 80s and say, what do we want this place to be? And go through that fabulous process. And Mark come back and do it again. To have those conversations, because I find it frustrating. It's just too easy to blame someone else instead of saying, how do we do it? And like Mr. Collins says, who's probably smarter than all of us in terms of development, there is so much development pressure that says maybe we can't stop it. Maybe we've already hit the tipping point, and it's just inevitable one by one. I'd hate to see that.
In the back.
Yeah, I'm really grateful for you putting this on too, because I wasn't in the community when all of this occurred, and sitting on the permit development review committee, I'm like I own, I'm drinking from a well I didn't dig. And I quite often just sit in awe and listen to the sages on my committees to see what the background is, because I'm a city duck. I'm clueless when some of these projects come in. But one of the things that got me involved was the really massive development that we're getting on lots. And I think, again, some of that goes back to the zoning code changes on FAR on sloped lots. Because what we've seen, certainly most of the property, this isn't so true down in the downtown area, but out in the neighborhoods, just about everything is on a slope. And you wind up with rather constrained building pads, even though the yard might be quite large. And people are trying to dump as much FAR out of that pad as they can. And it's just too big for the streetscape. Mm-hmm. So I think that's something else that could be, if you put this in your 24-item list, it's not in the PDO, but I think it's definitely affected the neighborhood quality and character around town. And that sort of mentality spills over into the downtown. I mean, I certainly feel a lot of the development downtown is too big for its britches. You know, perhaps if the massing had been broken up a little bit, and then back to the 30-foot height limit. I mean, Jim, I'm with you. I want that tower on that building. But
Yes.
I think if we have a little bit more variety in the massing on the buildings, for some places we're a little bit lower and some a little bit higher, and you broke the boxes up, you get rid of that blob sense. So you could average 30 feet, but not have every building getting 30 feet. And there's some other things that could probably be done to make the pedestrian environment more inviting, like making wider sidewalks and fixing up a lot of the deferred maintenance and stuff like that. But I really see good cooperation on my committee, and I'm honored to be there, and I think that that community spirit is still here.
Thank you. I think that the fact of the matter is that Girard Avenue and parts of Fay and all are two-story limits, and which is probably a very good thing, and as evidenced in some of Angelus's photographs. And I think the things that we've been talking about here are things that we complain about to ourselves all the time, and but they're not our problem. They're not the city's problem. This helps us get around problems that we otherwise would be faced with. But as far as being an independent community, I'm afraid I would probably be not enthusiastic about an independent La Jolla, because I think that the planners are very helpful at the city, and they in fact would rather be doing what we're doing as architects in some instances, and they enjoy being engaged in early discussions about, well, what do you think? Should we do this or should we do that? And they enjoy that kind of thing. So I've always tried to get the powers that be to be able to sit down for a 15-minute chat and expose them to some ideas early on. They're not taking a vote on it, they're not doing anything, but they could spot something that I've missed or that somebody else has missed or that the community group has missed before we get down the road too far. So it's been great help. So I don't think that we're complaining. I think it's a matter of fact, and we'd probably hear the same in other communities, but we have a different sort of model that we're working with here. Yes?
Just a couple of things since we're talking about history, and that is that the enforcement of the Coastal Commission plan was almost about the same time as the development of the local coastal programs, which the city of San Diego had to adopt. And they had to have rules that would pass the Coastal Commission at the state level. And I think the timing was such that there was a great enthusiasm on the part of the city to just utilize our planned districts as their coastal program as a whole. And then they also provided certain elements that were left out of our ordinance that can give us protections. They have called out viewpoints, they've called out our parks, they created diagrams of our transportation corridors and viewpoints along those. And so I think there was a certain synergy there between the state, this, and the local program that we're not enjoying right now when we are looking at new legislation.
Well, we have the La Jolla plan, of course, which interestingly enough, it has some very interesting things. If anybody has ever read it, it's quite delightful. And
yeah, a problem sometimes is that people at the city are so busy they don't have time to read the stuff. And it's unfortunate that we haven't developed maybe the close relationship with them so that they can trust us to be able to help them to understand what the plan says. I found that a number of times with my own staff. We did have one success recently. When the city updated the code, the municipal code, one of their objectives was to get rid of all the planned district ordinances. And La Jolla, both of them survived, which is amazing, because a lot of them were done away with. So, you know, I think the key is to find out a gentle way of engaging and dialoguing with city staff at all levels and with the politicians. It's very important, because they can make your life very easy.
Absolutely.
Or very, very difficult.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Both ways. And the trick is to make the code work with you instead of at cross purposes. And I keep saying that, but it does work. Yes?
How do you think that things are under a strong mayor system versus a city manager system regarding these kinds of issues?
Well, I'll answer as an ex-city person. I always wanted the strong mayor, because my image of a strong mayor was New York and, you know, a lot of the great cities of the country. However, having seen the strong mayor at work, I think we did much better with the city manager. I think the city council was much more responsible and responsive when they had the city manager do the day-to-day things, but they were able to request or require the city manager to do certain things for their districts. Right now, they probably are in a quandary, because the mayor is also an elected official.
Yeah.
So they have nothing, you know, above him.
It seems like everything's politicized this way, instead of just a professional manager whose nose is constantly on to the grindstone.
And I'm seeing that as a problem. So the mayor can really control everything and can be his fiefdom.
Yeah.
That's a problem.
Yes.
Angela, so you know what I was going to say about that? You know, you've been in numerous council meetings. You know what I miss? I miss the mayor being up on that dais and during public comment and having to be accountable to the people every week. Now the mayor, and you know, I'm not saying the current mayor, but the mayor's the best, they're just hiding up in their ivory tower instead of being there in front of people, and they have to actually face the public on a daily basis. And I really miss that, and I think it has been politicized. Yeah.
Yes.
Mark, we happen to have a 69,000 volt J box in our parking strip, which is starting to rust. It's been there for 6 years, and the rust at its present pace, I would say in another 6 years, we would truly have what you would call like marine scaling, flaking rust, and you know, I would think unless it's somehow taken care of in 15 years or something like that, it'll just be a hole in the ground with 5-inch 69,000 volt cable, which they were explaining to me as they put it in. They said, you know, this just doesn't have just insulation on it, because when you're dealing with these kinds of forces, you get these flux fields that go way outside it. So it has this incredibly complicated thing, and there's still a lot of electrons wandering around in there. But I don't really know what else you would do, though. I mean, after you get rid of the lines up in the air, would something be completely buried, or would you be able to put boxes someplace else? Or what do you do?
It can be buried,
sure,
but it's too expensive.
Yeah.
That's where business comes in. But it can be buried, and you know,
it can be put into the building
in other
too.
Places, all of these boxes are buried. You don't see them, and you don't see the wires.
And if we had utility tunnels, sorry to be griping like this, but if we actually had utility tunnels under the streets, then every time they needed to do something, they wouldn't have to cut the roadway again. They could just put it down in this tunnel, and I'm sure that it would pay off. If you're talking about long-term infrastructure, it would just seem that it would make much more economic sense to do that than to keep.
You know, in my short life as an architect, one of the frustrations I always had was when the plumbers and the electricians would come in. They would poke holes everywhere. They would put things wherever they please, and I kept saying, now wait a minute, you know, didn't I put this corridor here so that everything would be in there together? And it's the same thing with utilities in the city. They put them anywhere they please. They don't think in terms of fixing them, the work they have to go through to fix them, and so on. You're absolutely right.
They were the lowest bidder.
I guess. And when we redid the street lights on Girard, I discovered that, you know, the power cables were only about 18 inches down, and they were directly going underneath the line of trees.
Yeah.
On the sidewalk there, so.
Not a good place, yes.
You need to call the university art students, because we live up by the university, and every day there's a new art project on one of those boxes. It's terrific. I don't know who does that or how they get done, but I think it's a night job.
Well, actually, you can apply and
can.
present your artwork, and they will pay for your supplies.
Well, some of them were pretty interesting.
And some awfully dull, too. Yes.
To go back to the PDO question.
Yes.
I think you mentioned it was about a decade ago that you made those 24 revisions. So do you think if you revisited those today, would the community still support them? Or would there be maybe additions to them that have developed over the past 10 years?
Can you answer that?
I think we covered most of them pretty well, but there's always new refinements.
I think it wouldn't hurt to just have a group of people that care about this, review it, talk about some of the problems, and do the tweaking.
I mean, my pet peeves at the moment for what we have to enforce is definitely the joint parking agreements, enforcing the 8-foot wide sidewalks instead of the 6-foot that the city standard is, and the city always falls back on their standard instead of following, or 5, instead of following our 8 feet. The basement definition. The basement definition in the PDO does not coordinate well with the basement definition in the 2000 zoning code update, and leaves a surprising amount of space above ground and still be called a basement. Personally, I'm sitting here thinking, okay, there are all these architects involved in writing this darn PDO that I'm working on now, and architecture, or an architect's office, is not an allowed office use. Realtors are legal, interior designers are legal, but architects aren't. What were you guys thinking?
In the retail zone.
In the retail zone.
That's right.
I'm sorry. Anyhow.
It was Angie.
Similar uses.
And on a total side note, personally, I think that there's been an evolution in the community over the last 25 years.
Yes.
And that there's a number of places where the PDO now leans towards residential on the second floor, where I don't think residential is any longer an appropriate use as a second floor, and it would be a higher and better purpose as an office space. I think that those big box offices that came in gave a bad name to offices, but small little offices above retail areas would be very appropriate. For example, I'm down in Bird Rock and I think in that strip along La Jolla Boulevard, there is so much traffic and it is very noisy that putting residential on the second floor is not highly desirable. It's not going to get good rents, but a lot of people who live in the neighborhood, now that you telecommute, might just need maybe a small little office where they can get away from the dog barking or the kids making noise and want to have an office that they can walk to from their Bird Rock community and be able to go to an upstairs office. And you could still maintain your retail need for the first floor, just some personal observations.
And of course, I've always thought that Bird Rock should be Zone 2 instead of Zone 4, so that you let the demand determine what's on the first floor, because there's no way that Bird Rock can support 3.5 acres of retail space, which is what the code says that it has to now have.
It's been hard.
Yes.
But I think the whole point here is there are going to be a lot more pressures on La Jolla in the development direction.
Yes.
And all we want to do is have an orderly way to help guide those so that the whole community benefits, not just a single property.
And actually, I would love to see residential in the blocks.
Yes.
Upper floors.
Right. We are actually going to do that.
I know, you are doing that.
Yes.
A fairly narrow question. Who let La Jolla Elementary paint the building that color? How did that happen?
La Jolla Elementary sits outside of the PDO.
Yes. It just is a notch out of it. Yes, Diane?
Yeah, just point of information. When the PDO was under writing and administrative review, how much of downtown La Jolla is served by blocks?
You can see it right now, the blocks are there.
There are no new ones.
There have not been any new ones. We caught it at the very beginning, but it was really beginning to pick up speed by the time they got caught.
Because I guess my question is, you saw a problem, and you can see, what happened to stuff that was in the pipeline? Was that allowed to be built, or did you do a moratorium, or how did you actually deal with?
Well, what we did is we had that emergency ordinance for a year that cut everything in half.
That was from October 12th, 1983 to December 12th, 1984.
So did that took effect immediately, so that anything that had not yet been approved was just shut down?
Yeah.
Any more questions?
One more question. People around here say that, when times are good, you can't get a parking place in any of the garages. They've all got big, long waiting lists.
No, you know what? We found out because we set up a parking and transportation committee that is still functioning, I believe. And the reason we set it up was we had some $125,000 from the Coastal Commission that were sitting in a kitty that were supposed to be used for transportation in La Jolla. And I was, I think, the only person in town that knew about that. So to use it, we set up a committee and we did a survey. And we found out that the blocks are using only the first and the ground floor. They have at least one or two more. The other two are blocked off.
Blocked off?
Yes. The owners don't want to rent them. They are not interested. We actually had parking companies come to them and ask them, would you rent to us, these floors, and then we in turn will rent them to the employees, because we felt the employees should be going to these parking areas, so that way the exterior area could be used by the people that come to do business. But the owners didn't want to do it, and the reason they didn't want to do it is it's an additional expense for them. They have to clean them, they have to supervise them, they have to do all of these things, and they just didn't want to be bothered. My own assessment is that probably there is not even air circulation into the lower levels. So if you go in there, you choke. But that's a fact, and that's why we don't have parking in La Jolla. We have plenty of parking in La Jolla, believe me, if we care to use it.
One other thing in regards to a little bit of history. When, for example, when the Merrill Lynch building was built, I can remember distinctly how we went through and measured each use, with retail, how much restaurant, how much office, et cetera. And that really was what determined the number of parking places that were going to be under there. At that particular time, the whole thought was that these then would provide the parking for their employees, and they had excess parking for what the uses were going to need. The whole idea on that, though, originally in terms of the parking, was that it was going to be free. That's what the building was for. Well, that got challenged in court and lost, and then what you saw happening then is they started charging rents, and so that's when you saw a lot of the employees no longer willing to pay the, $50, $60, $70, $80 a month to park, and so that's also one of the reasons a lot of these underground parking places are empty today. So
there was an agreement from the building owners to begin with that their parking would be free, but it was challenged in state court or something.
He's asking questions.
Yeah. It's a city requirement that it be free.
There was lots of city requirements that many of those. For instance, 30-some years ago, I did the Bank of America parking garage, and there are 210 parking places there, something like that. And way more than the bank needs, so it's public. And I think the bank required 70, something like that, 40 of which were to be given to the employees without charge. And I think that worked for a certain length of time until it became forgotten in certain people's memories, and then the charging started. But it was always public parking in that particular use. But
Jim, why don't we get as much input from the people here as we can?
Absolutely.
So we know where we're going.
That's right. Do we have any more questions?
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. You've been very patient.